When we think of ghost stories, we often think of the supernatural, the rattling of chains, a sudden chill in the air, or a pale figure appearing in a moonlit hallway. But Julian Hawthorne's collection, the Lock and Key Library, suggests that the most terrifying hauntings aren't caused by spirits, but by the people standing right next to us. To understand this collection, you first have to understand the era it inhabits. This was a time when detective fiction was evolving from the early blueprints laid down by Edgar Allan Poe and his investigator C. Auguste Dupin into the structured, forensic whodunits we recognize today. It was a period obsessed with the tension between the unseen world and the cold, hard facts of science. The book begins not with a mystery, but with an essay by Rudyard Kipling that sets a very specific, oppressive mood. He writes about the unsettling atmosphere of the dak bungalows in India, those colonial government guest houses that stood as lonely outposts in a vast, unfamiliar landscape. Kipling describes how the isolation and the heavy, stifling heat create a sense of dread, a feeling that the environment itself is hostile. It's that primal sensation that something is watching you from the shadows, even if there's nothing there. This establishes the thematic foundation for the rest of the collection. It starts with that kind of atmospheric, colonial dread, moves into the sharp, cold light of detective logic, and finally descends into the messy, unpredictable territory of the human mind. The collection brings us into the world of Sherlock Holmes, but not in the way you might expect. We see him tackling a case that is less about a grand international conspiracy and more about the small mechanical details of everyday life. A man named James Windybank has been playing a very long, very patient game. He's been pretending to be a phantom suitor named Mr. Hosmer Angel, using a disguise to woo his own stepdaughter. His goal was simple and predatory, to secure her inheritance by manipulating her emotions from behind a mask. What's fascinating here is how Holmes dismantles the deception. He doesn't catch Windybank through a dramatic chase or a confession under pressure, but through the tiny imperfections of a typewriter. By noticing minute defects in the way letters were struck on the page, the specific mechanical fingerprint of the machine, Holmes is able to unmask the fraud. It's a powerful reminder that while people can change their faces, their voices, or their identities, they rarely manage to change the mechanical habits of their hands or the tools they leave behind. This leads us into one of the most famous stories in the collection, where Holmes faces a challenge that isn't just a puzzle, but a personal defeat. The King of Bohemia needs help recovering a compromising photograph held by a singer named Irene Adler. Holmes, usually so in control of every variable, employs a high-stakes ruse to get what he wants. He orchestrates a fake assault on the king's chambers, using a smoke rocket to create a sudden, chaotic distraction. His goal is to trigger Adler's survival instinct, knowing that in a moment of panic, a person will instinctively reach for their most precious secret to protect it. It works. She reveals the hiding place of the photograph. But Holmes's victory is short-lived. Adler outmaneuvers him by using a male disguise to escape, leaving him not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound, lasting respect for her intellect. She becomes the woman, the one person who proved that even the greatest logical mind can be outplayed by human resourcefulness. In the context of the whole book, Adler represents the human ghost, someone who can vanish into plain sight through sheer will and intelligence. The stories then shift away from the drawing rooms of London to the desolate, windswept coast of Scotland. Here, the atmosphere returns to that sense of isolation we saw in Kipling's dak bungalows. We meet Frank Cassilis, a man who finds himself caught in a web of international secrets. He becomes entangled with a volatile man named Northmer and a young woman named Clara Huddlestone. As the tension builds, we learn that Clara's father, a disgraced banker, has stolen a massive sum of money from the Italian Carbonari, a secret society of revolutionaries. The situation escalates into a tense siege at a pavilion, where the characters are forced to defend themselves against the pursuing Italians. This segment of the book highlights the breakdown of social order when faced with raw violence. It isn't a grand, sweeping battle that resolves the conflict, but a moment of pure, chaotic chance. A fire breaks out, and in the confusion, the group is scattered. Northmer, driven by an impulse toward conflict and a refusal to conform to society, chooses a life of permanent exile and revolution, while Frank and Clara manage to survive the night's terror. They are left forever changed, not by a ghost, but by the weight of political secrets and the desperation of men. And there the book takes a turn into something much darker and more psychological, exploring the uncanny, the feeling that something is familiar yet deeply wrong. We meet Francis Raven, a man haunted by a recurring dream of a woman attacking him with a knife. This isn't just a passing nightmare, it's a shadow that follows him through his life, suggesting a destiny he cannot escape. Years later, he meets a woman named Alicia Warlock, who feels strikingly like the woman from his dreams. He calls her the Dream Woman. But rather than a romantic reunion, their marriage becomes a descent into madness and alcoholism. The horror of the story is that the dream becomes a reality. In a final, deadly confrontation, Alicia attempts to kill Francis with the very same knife from his visions. He survives, but he is left in a state of permanent paranoia, forever looking over his shoulder. It raises a chilling question: was he haunted by a prophecy, or was he driven by psychological trauma to find the very person who would destroy him? This theme of the psychological experiment is explored again in a different, more clinical way. In another tale, a surgeon attempts to use a leap year experiment to cure a man's irrational fears. The idea is to use a calendar trick to prove that the man's fears are merely delusions based on a misunderstanding of time. It's a very modern, scientific approach to the human soul. The belief that if you can just map the logic of the fear, you can delete it. However, the experiment fails in the most tragic way possible. While the doctors are busy trying to prove the fear is a delusion, a real murder occurs under the cover of darkness, committed by a woman linked to the man's past. It's a devastating irony. The scientific attempt to cure the man's paranoia actually provided the cover for the very thing he feared to happen. It's a reminder that you can't always use logic to solve a problem that is rooted in deep, irrational trauma. The collection also takes time to explore the art of the hoax, looking at how easily we are deceived by the things we think we know. We see the Duke of Datchet being terrorized by a sophisticated kidnapping plot involving forged letters and a lock of hair. It's a high-stakes drama that feels like it could unravel a noble house, only for it to be revealed as a decoy scheme, a clever, calculated attempt to extort money through fear. Even the objects we interact with can be part of the deception. There is a story about a haunted meerschaum pipe that appears to move on its own. It's a classic piece of supernatural suspense, but the truth is grounded in biology. The ghost in the pipe is actually a small, living reptile that has been coated in gum and attached to the stem. When the heat from the tobacco reaches it, the creature moves, creating the illusion of a haunting. This is the ultimate expression of the book's philosophy. The supernatural is often just science we haven't figured out yet, or a trick played by a clever mind. When we step back and look at the whole collection, a clear pattern emerges. Hawthorne is interested in the tension between scientific logic and the terrifying power of human perception. There is a recurring movement from the atmospheric and the unexplained toward the mechanical and the biological. Whether it's Sherlock Holmes using a typewriter defect to solve a crime, or a scientist using a calendar to try and cure a nightmare, the message is consistent. There is almost always a rational explanation for the things that scare us. But the book doesn't just stop at science solves everything. It also explores the idea of human ghosts. The most effective hauntings in these stories aren't the ones that come from the grave, but the ones that come from human deception and psychological manipulation. A man wearing a disguise to steal an inheritance is a ghost that haunts a family. A woman who embodies a recurring nightmare is a ghost that haunts a marriage. These are the deceptions that are much harder to solve than a moving pipe or a forged letter, because they require us to look past the surface and into the darkest corners of the human heart. There is also a constant tension between observing and seeing. Many of these characters, especially Holmes, possess the ability to observe the minute, forensic details that others miss. They see the ash on a sleeve or the defect in a typewriter key. But the stories often suggest that even with all the data in the world, you can still miss the truth if you don't understand the human element. You can observe the facts of a crime, but you might fail to see the motive, the madness, or the desperation that drove it. In the end, the collection leaves us with a somewhat unsettling thought. While science and logic can dismantle a supernatural event, they don't necessarily make the world any less frightening. In fact, finding out that a ghost is actually a man in a disguise or a reptile in a pipe doesn't make the world safer. It just reveals that the people around us are capable of much more calculated and intentional cruelty. The reality of human intent is often more malleable and far more terrifying than the ghosts we fear in the dark. We spend so much time looking for the supernatural, But as this collection shows, the real mysteries and the real monsters are much closer to home